Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party, and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
This is the second in a two-part mini-series we're doing to mark the resignation of Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister, and the search for his successor. So in our last episode, Richard, we described the orchestrated way in which Harold Wilson told the Queen, then the Cabinet, and then the hierarchy of the Labour Party, and then the country, that he was going to be resigning as Prime Minister. And then the rather lavish way in which he hosted dinners with the Cabinet, with members of the royal family, in order to round off his career at the top of British politics. In this episode, we're focused on the leadership election that followed his resignation. And I certainly have in the last episode, rather hyped this up as being one in which there was outstanding quality of leadership candidates who were putting themselves forward. Hopefully that will be evident to you throughout the episode, but if we're just to make a comparison that I think might show why this leadership election is so worth talking about. When Wilson resigns, the people who are vying to replace him, and if you're familiar with post-war British politics, many of these names would be familiar to you already, are Jim Callaghan, Michael Foot, Denis Healey, Tony Benn, Anthony Crosland, and Roy Jenkins. The last Labour leadership election we've had was Keir Starmer, Lisa Nandy, and Rebecca Long-Bailey. Now, I'm not necessarily an advocate, although I confess to indulging in it quite a bit, of the idea that everything in politics is so much worse than it once was. It's clearly in lots of ways not true. But certainly when it comes to the calibre of Labour leadership contests, I think we can say it is true. And to really put that into sharp focus, this week we're looking at what was probably the very best of the lot. So, Richard, before we really get on to the people and how this contest unfolded, can you tell us a little bit about the procedure for picking Wilson's successor?
Yes, so we need to go back to Tuesday, the 16th of March, 1976. This is the day that Harold Wilson surprises the country and the Labour Party with his resignation. At about 10:15, Harold Wilson had gone to the palace to inform the Queen that he was resigning as leader of the Labour Party and would resign as Prime Minister once a successor had been elected. At about 10 to 11, he meets with senior members of the Cabinet to inform them that he's about to resign. At 11 o'clock, he meets with the whole Cabinet, reads out his resignation statement, and then basically leaves. And he puts his deputy, Ted Short, in charge of the Cabinet meeting, and he goes off, as you said, Lee, to talk to various senior figures in the Labour Party and the Labour movement. And one of the people that Harold Wilson sees at about 11:30 that morning is the MP for Anglesey, Cledwyn Hughes. And Cledwyn Hughes was at that time the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party. And he will be tasked with organising the Labour leadership election. I think he's the first MP who emerges from Downing Street. And by this point, word is already getting out about Wilson's resignation. I think the Cabinet is still in session as this is happening. And he is asked immediately by the press about how the leadership election is going to go. And he says, "We have no rules. This is the first time a Labour Prime Minister in office has retired. We're calling a meeting to discuss drafting rules of procedure." He was then asked, "When were you told of the Prime Minister's decision?" "Well, I was called in by the Prime Minister at 11:30. It's come as a surprise, though it's quite clear the Prime Minister had come to this decision some weeks ago." In one sense, it's true. It was the first time in the history of the Labour Party that the incumbent Prime Minister resigned while Prime Minister, and there had to be a leadership election to replace them. The only other time that that's happened in Labour history was in 2007 when Tony Blair resigned. In that case, there was only one candidate, Gordon Brown, who was able to get sufficient nominations. Although John McDonnell and Michael Meacher, both on the left of the party, did try to get nominations, but they didn't get sufficient ones. On the other hand, the Labour Party did have a procedure for electing a leader. It was something that would happen, or could have happened every year, in fact, under the rules of the Labour Party at that time at the annual meeting. The last time there had been a Labour leadership election was in 1963 when Hugh Gateskill died. And that was when Harold Wilson was elected. Labour was out of office. But basically, it becomes clear that the same procedure that was used when Wilson was elected in 1963 is basically going to be used again in 1976.
And of course, that's in part the product of a development that's happened in the last decade or so before this, or the preceding decade or so, because the appointment of a prime minister is an act of the royal prerogative. It is ultimately for the palace to appoint the prime minister. But as we've discussed in this podcast before, in particular in 1963, when Harold Macmillan resigned and the Earl of Hume, Alec Douglas Hume, became prime minister, by that stage, the view of the palace was pretty much, and then soon after was absolutely, that they wanted to be told who the party wanted to lead it. They did not want to have to try and pick somebody who could lead the party on the basis of informal advice. So even though, in one sense, and I guess that's what's underlying the comment that he made, in one sense, the selection or the election of a prime minister midterm is different to a leader of the opposition. By this stage, the British Constitution had evolved to the point that they could be treated exactly the same, really.
Yes, and actually a couple of weeks into this process, the Observer praises the Labour Party and Cledwyn Hughes for this procedure. They write, Mr. Cledwyn Hughes, the chairman of the Parliamentary Party, has so far conducted the election admirably, with decorum and efficiency, conscious that for the first time a British political party is electing a Prime Minister, no doubt to the infinite relief of Her Majesty, who must have other things on her mind.
So you said it'd be the same leadership rules as we used in 1963 to elect Harold Wilson. What were those actual rules?
So the rules were, as I understand it, that an MP simply needed to gather a proposer and seconder, and then their name was entered into the ballot. That the process would be a series of ballots by elimination, whereby the lowest placed candidate would be eliminated until you got to a final ballot of two candidates, and then the person who got a majority, as would of course be the case in a two-candidate system, would become the leader. Now, Wilson told Cledwyn Hughes, there's no need to rush. I'd like a little bit of time to wrap things up. So he said to Hughes, I don't want the ballot this week. Give me at least a week to sort my affairs. And that was particularly because Wilson wanted to have this dinner with the Queen. And the first ballot of the Labour leadership contest happens on Thursday, the 25th of March. That makes it sound all very smooth, and in a sense it was, but I should say that there were, as is inevitable within the Labour Party, dissenting voices over this procedure. In particular, the left of the party, the Young Socialists were the leading voice of this, called for a special conference and said that the Labour leader should not be elected by MPs alone, but there should be a special conference where the delegates at the conference should elect the leader and therefore the Prime Minister. This was not the tradition of the Labour Party. However, in that decade, in the 1970s, Labour had had two special conferences on Europe to decide the party's position on Europe. In both instances, overwhelmingly, the party took a Eurosceptic position. The first one was against joining, and the second one was in favour of leaving. And so the Young Socialists and the left of the party said, well, let's basically adopt that same model, but this time to elect the Prime Minister. But it didn't get anywhere. It was very irregular, and it was inconsistent with the traditions of the party, whereby every Labour leader had been previously elected by the parliamentary party. Of course, it does foreshadow that from 1981 onwards, members will have a say in the selection of a leader, but not yet.
It's always really tempting with these things to try and draw comparisons, and we mustn't do it too much. But two things that will be very different as and when, if and when Keir Starmer falls. Of course, one will be the timeline. this is really quite rapid compared to leadership elections now, just as we saw with when the Conservatives were in office, and these could be months-long processes, largely for the reason, of course, that you described about the involvement of members rather than just the parliamentary party. And the second one, which I think is always quite interesting, is that over the years, the parties have significantly increased the number of supporters you need to be able to stand. So it used to be the case in the Tory party as well. You just needed a proposer and a seconder. Same in this case in 1976 for Labour. And what that meant half a century ago is that you had more people standing for the leadership than it would be possible to stand for the leadership today. Because now in the Labour Party, you need 20% of MPs to nominate you in order to stand. So even if everybody divided absolutely evenly into camps, you could at most get 5 people. In practice, I suspect you'd struggle to get more than 3, I would have thought, particularly given the way the momentum often flows towards an early frontrunner.
One might say you could get 4 if the incumbent was challenged, because under the rules, the incumbent doesn't need to gather signatures. However, I would think that a sensible incumbent would try to gather signatures anyway in order to ward off competition.
I think that's right. And so already, just for thinking about the procedure, you can see how the first occasion on which Labour tries to pick a leader who is also Prime Minister will be just dramatically different to how it would be if it were to play out once again. So let's come on to talk about the candidates who are standing for this. And we should start with, I think it's fair to say, the only member of the cabinet who really had advance notice that the Prime Minister was going, certainly who had heard it in terms from the Prime Minister that he was going to go. And that's the Foreign Secretary, Jim Callaghan.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is worth saying that other members of the cabinet had been told from December of 1975 that it looked like the Prime Minister would be going in the next few months. But you're right, Lee, that Callaghan was told the Thursday beforehand, as we discussed in our previous episode. Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan are in a ministerial car being driven from a birthday party, Harold Wilson's birthday party, in fact, to the vote in the House of Commons. And it's in that car that Harold Wilson says to Callaghan, I'm going to resign at the next cabinet meeting on Tuesday. So you're right, Callaghan was the first to have a definitive forewarning of it. Callaghan is seen as the front runner for sure from the start. Indeed, Bernard Donahue, Harold Wilson's chief policy advisor, writes in his diary the following day, it looks all sewn up for Callaghan. Jim Callaghan had a sterling CV. He had been Harold Wilson's first Chancellor. Then he becomes Wilson's Home Secretary. Those were the 2 roles that he fulfilled in that 1964 to 70 Labour government. And then when Labour comes back into office in March of 1974, Wilson appoints him as Foreign Secretary. As it happens, Jim Callaghan is the only Prime Minister to have held all 4 of those great offices of state: Chancellor, Home Secretary, Foreign Secretary, and Prime Minister. Wilson claimed that he didn't have a preference for his successor, but the fact that he'd given Callaghan this forewarning, I think, can be reasonably interpreted that he did want Callaghan to succeed him. On the one hand, that may be surprising because Callaghan was from the right of the party, Wilson had come from the left of the party. Indeed, the 2 of them stood against each other in the 1963 Labour leadership election. It was Wilson as the candidate at the left, and the Labour right was split between George Brown and Jim Callaghan. One of the reasons why Wilson probably did want Callaghan to succeed him is that Callaghan had been extremely loyal to Wilson throughout all of the time that Wilson had been Prime Minister. He was not someone that Wilson saw as a plotter or as someone who sought to undermine him, but only saw his role as there to strengthen and support the government. And I think Wilson really respected him for that. In terms of Callaghan's positioning within the Labour Party, he is one of the candidates of the right of the party. I'm going to talk about the different candidates of the right and the left. But he's what we would call perhaps the candidate of the trade union right of the party. Callaghan himself came from a working class background. He'd been a clerk, he'd been a naval man, and he had been a trade union official. So he was seen of the of the trade union right of the party. And I guess what that really means is it's a somewhat socially conservative element of the Labour Party, focused on what we might kind of call the bread and butter material issues of the Labour movement, and less so the kind of highfalutin socialist idealism that you might see more on the Labour left, or indeed on some elements of the more intellectual side of Labour right.
What's fascinating, I think, about Callaghan and his candidacy is he is, for the reasons you set out, really the most qualified as the triple holder of the great offices of state. He's going into this with the most significant senior government experience behind him. He is also the person in this leadership field who has, like you say, come from the greatest poverty. In fact, the only one to really come from poverty at all.
I mean, you could say that Roy Jenkins, of course, was a miner's son, but he was a miner's son who then became uh, a Labour member of Parliament and a trusted ally of Clement Attlee. In contrast, Jim Callaghan's father died when he was a boy, and his mother was left to raise him on her own. She'd been twice widowed by the time she was in her 30s, and and they had to effectively rely on charity of local fishermen giving them spare scraps of fish so that they wouldn't go hungry. So it was a very difficult upbringing that he had.
Connected to that, of course, is the fact that his education, in spite of his qualifications from practical service in government, but his education was the poorest of any of them. So he didn't go to university. Everybody else who we're going to talk about went to Oxford.
And there were people who looked down on Callaghan for this, even people on the Labour right. So Dick Leonard, who was a supporter of Tony Crosland seen more on sort of on the right of the party, sort of viewed Callaghan and the trade union sponsored MPs who backed him as, quote, the least imaginative members of the PLP. So this was effectively a form of middle class snobbery against the working class members of the parliamentary party, of which Callaghan was one.
Well, let's come on to the more middle class contingent then, the first of the five Oxonians that we'll talk about. Let's start with somebody who is, unlike Callaghan, a figure of the left, and who is the only other person who we'll talk about who would become a Labour leader, although not on this occasion, and that is Michael Foot. The thing that I think is really interesting about Michael Foot is that it's impossible now to look back and think of him without all of the baggage of his 1980 to 1983 leadership of the Labour Party. The donkey jacket, the landslide election defeat, the perception that he simply wasn't up to it, that he was Labour's worst leader, the famous allegation by Gerald Kaufman that the 83 manifesto was the longest suicide note in history. Just somewhat unfair, but it's a very catchy turn of phrase. So we think of Michael Foot now when we look back at him unavoidably because of all of that. But of course, that's not the Michael Foot we're dealing with in 1976. He's younger. He looks a bit less scraggly. Not scraggly, I think it's fair to say, but he looks a bit less scraggly. And he is a really highly respected member of the government. But interestingly, he was only come into government in this second iteration of Wilson as Prime Minister.
That's right. I mean, so Foot had refused ministerial office in the 1960s. He wanted to preserve his independence as a backbencher and effectively to speak truth to power. But he does join the government after the February 74 election, and Wilson appoints him employment secretary. This is a very important role because industrial relations, which is effectively what he would be responsible for in cabinet, had been what brought down the Conservative government under Edward Heath. And it's Foot's job to basically get the trade unions to agree to cooperate with the government rather than undermine the government. And he's seen as very successful in doing this. This is the time of what was called the social contract, where the unions agreed to exercise restraint in the demands that they were insisting on from their employers and the government, in exchange for the government providing enhanced benefits and rights for the working class. And it was seen as a great triumph, really, by Michael Foot. At the cabinet meeting on the 16th of March 1976, Foote, unlike Callaghan, is completely caught unawares of the announcement that's going to come. And when the cabinet meeting wraps up, Barbara Castle goes up to Michael Foote and grabs him by the arm and says, "You've got to stand for the leadership." And next to them is Peter Shaw, figure of the left of the party as well, and he agrees enthusiastically and says Michael has to be the candidate for the left. Foote, in his characteristic self-effacing style, replies, "Perhaps we must discuss it." But Castle thought the fact that he'd said, "we must discuss it," was evidence in her mind that he had already decided there and then in that meeting that he was actually going to go for it. So Foote almost immediately was seen as the chief candidate of the left of the party. Many of the figures of the left rallied around him quite quickly. His campaign manager was John Silkin, who was a left-wing minister. Neil Kinnock, who was at that time quite a young, fresh Labour MP, elected in 1970, becomes the deputy campaign manager for Foote. Eric Heffer, who had resigned from the government over Europe, believing that the government had been insufficiently Eurosceptic, becomes effectively the bruiser for the Foote campaign. Now, as you say, Lee, we often think of Michael Foote as this doddery old man. I think it's really cruel and unfortunate the way that people talk about Michael Foote. I actually think he was one of the greatest leaders of the Labour Party, certainly my favourite leader. And he did look older than his years, but he actually was, he was younger than Jim Callaghan. He was 16 months younger than Jim Callaghan. So there wasn't any perception that Foote was sort of past it at this point by any means.
One of the challenges in all leadership elections, particularly when you have, as we do in the UK, relatively broad parties in ideological terms. Of course, big open question as to whether or not that's going to continue. But one of the big challenges that you often have is that there will be people on the left of a party, people on the right of a party, or people who represent different traditions or different factions within it. And the more people you have coming from one wing or one faction, the more challenging it is to look as if a candidate from that wing or faction has got momentum going into the race. All of which is a roundabout way of saying that another one of these candidates, rather like Michael Foote, is somebody who we think of as being on the Labour left, certainly, and a very famous and distinguished figure of the Labour left, not somebody who I personally think would have ever been a good choice as leader or prime minister, but really one of the most admired and liked politicians of the last few decades, and that is Tony Benn.
Yes, so Benn decides independently and subsequent to Michael Foote that he is going to stand, and Benn is also a figure of the left of the party. Many of the MPs on the left were not pleased with this. Judith Hart, who had been a left-wing minister, she had resigned in a bit of a confusing set of circumstances after the 1975 referendum briefly, but otherwise had been pretty much the overseas development minister for most of the Wilson and then the Callaghan governments, went on national television when Harold Wilson resigned and was asked who the left would support. And she said, "There is Tony Benn, there is Michael Foote. I think at the moment, Tony is 10 years younger than Michael or more." Not sure why she said at the moment. That's a fixed fact, really. I think that myself, were Michael prepared to stand, and I don't know that he is, he could unite the Labour movement. Well, it was clear, actually, that Michael Foote was prepared to stand. And Judith Hart went to Tony Benn and pleaded with him not to stand for the leader. She said to Benn, "Tony, I love you dearly. I greatly admire you. You must be the leader of the party. One day, but not now." But Benn told Judith Hart that he had no option. He needed to stand to put forward alternative economic policies that the Labour government should pursue. Hart was very upset. She told him that she just could not support him. She had to support Michael Foote. She then said, "I hope you know I'm very fond of you." He then kissed her to console her. All very dramatic. Barbara Castle, who, as you remember, had grabbed Michael Foot by the arm after the cabinet meeting and said, "You must stand," was furious when she heard that Tony Benn was standing as well. And she marched to his office and confronted him somewhat less emotionally than Judith Hart, but with the same message. She said to Benn, she used to call him Wedgie, as his proper longer name is Anthony Wedgwood Benn. "Wedgie, the future is with you, but not at the moment. The election is a forceps delivery," she told him, "not a natural transition. And it wouldn't be pretty. They needed everyone in the operating theatre on the same page." So using this sort of rather graphic image of a difficult birth, she's arguing that any distraction from focusing on getting Michael Foot elected could potentially risk the whole operation. Benn in his diaries reveals that even his close advisors, people who were working for him, he had two Francises who worked for him, Francis Morel and Francis Cripps. One was a man called Francis and one was a woman called Francis, so IS and ES. They initially had been warm on the idea of him standing, but as time went on, they realized that this was potentially distracting from the momentum of Michael Foot, and they said that they asked him to withdraw his candidacy, and Benn would have would hear nothing of it, and he got quite cross when his spads told him that they thought he should pull back. I think that's quite striking that they felt able to tell him that. And he said it's nothing to do with him, this candidacy. It wasn't about him. It was about policies, and that he wanted to be able to advocate for more left-wing policies. Well, Michael Foot met with Benn and told Benn that a Labour leadership election is not about policies, and it's very unhelpful and distracting, particularly when the party is in government, to start opening up a discussion about which policies the government should or shouldn't pursue, which in itself I think is quite interesting. But I don't think Foot actually sort of asked him directly to drop out, but Foot's intervention did not convince Benn to withdraw. Benn sort of, in his somewhat sanctimonious way, he did have a bit of a sanctimonious streak about him, was asked by the BBC if they could do a profile on him for the World This Weekend. And Benn said that he would only agree to the profile if he was allowed to purely discuss policies and not talk about himself in the profile. He said, "If you want to have me doing the washing up like Mrs. Thatcher, then it's a no." I actually don't think it was Margaret Thatcher who the press showed doing the washing up during the Conservative leadership contest, which I think is what he's referring to. I think it was Willie Whitelaw. I've seen pictures of Willie Whitelaw with his marigolds on doing the washing up in his London flat.
You're right. In 1975, for the Conservative leadership election, Willie Whitelaw was photographed in his flat in Chelsea, I think it was, doing the washing up to try and make him seem a bit more man of the people. I think what Benn may have in mind about Thatcher was for the October 1974 election campaign. There was one time in that when Margaret Thatcher was photographed doing the washing up at home. So clearly quite a popular way to appear down to earth in mid-1970s Britain. So they are the two candidates who will basically fight to represent the left of the Labour Party in this contest, Michael Foot and Tony Benn. But Jim Callaghan's not going to have an easy run on the right, certainly. They're going to be, if anything, that's going to be more crowded. But there is some nuance which is worth us discussing about different traditions and different parts of the Labour right. So let's start with somebody who I think offers a striking comparison in some respects with Jim Callaghan and is also a very credible potential Prime Minister in his own eyes and certainly in the eyes of many of his supporters. And that is Roy Jenkins. One of the reasons I think he's such an interesting person to think about in this context is we spoke about last time that Wilson had led a party that was deeply divided and deeply factional for much of the time he was in charge. And again, knowing what was to come, Roy Jenkins, of course, is one of the people who walks out of the Labour Party and tries to set up a rival and usurp the Labour Party as the Social Democratic or the left-wing party in British politics.
I wouldn't call it left-wing.
Well, but at this stage, of course, he's trying to lead Labour. What's his pitch?
Well, Jenkins was Callaghan's most serious rival on the right, but he had really damaged his reputation in the years before. So I think that if Harold Wilson had resigned in 1970 after losing that general election to Edward Heath, Roy Jenkins would have been seen as a very strong and credible candidate for the leadership. He'd had a successful time as Home Secretary, and then he became Chancellor. However, when Labour went into opposition, Jenkins really damaged his reputation in the party, and he damaged it over the issue of Europe. Now, Callaghan was quite Eurosceptic. In the early 1970s, Callaghan travelled the country arguing that Britain should not join the common market. And there are some wonderful speeches that Jim Callaghan gave about how joining the European Economic Community, what would become the EU, would reduce the British Parliament to the status of Hampshire County Council. And no offence to councillors in the room, that it would reduce MPs to little more than councillors within a European superstate. Jenkins, on the other hand, although they were both on the right of the party and Labour was split. You had right-wing Eurosceptics like Callaghan, and before him, of course, Hugh Gaitskell, Harold Wilson's predecessor as Labour leader, was an ardent Eurosceptic. You had people like Douglas Jay, who was on the right of the party, had served in the Attlee and Wilson ministries, but was Eurosceptic. But many of the MPs on the right of the party were Europhile, and Jenkins was the leader of the Europhiles, so much so that Jenkins leads a cadre of MPs to vote to join the common market in 1972, which is against the Labour position. Labour had a 3-line whip to vote against joining the common market, but Jenkins rebels. In order to do that, he has to resign his position in the shadow cabinet, and he does so in April 1972. This is seen as a great betrayal by many Labour MPs, of course, particularly by Eurosceptics. Were it not for Jenkins and his merry men, then Edward Heath would not have been able to take Britain into the common market. And also the Heath government probably would have fallen at that point. I mean, it would have been such a major defeat for the government. It's difficult to see how it would have survived. And so Jenkins was blamed for propping up a Tory government and an institution that was viewed as fundamentally anti-socialist. Nonetheless, Jenkins was still a respected figure in the party. He had been seen to be a successful chancellor, even if his reputation was somewhat damaged. In 1973, in the autumn 1973, he stands for the shadow cabinet. You've got to remember, in those days, the Labour leader did not get to pick who was in and out of the shadow cabinet. That was chosen by the MPs when you're in opposition. So he stands for the shadow cabinet in the autumn 1973. He comes 5th in the shadow cabinet election. So that shows that he does still have some important stature within the party. And Wilson does a shadow cabinet, rearranges his shadow cabinet. Shirley Williams had been the shadow Home Secretary. I think that's forgotten. If it hadn't been for Roy Jenkins, Shirley Williams may have become the first woman Home Secretary, because there's an election a few months later. As it happens, she's pushed out and takes on this rather curious role of Price's secretary. That's the role she would take in the government. And Jenkins is put back in his old role in the Home Office. Jenkins was disappointed that he'd been made Home Secretary. He wanted to be Chancellor again, and he felt that he was somewhat sidelined by being Home Secretary. One of his supporters, Bill Rogers, realised that the second round as Home Secretary was not going to be helpful for Jenkins's career. He said to Jenkins, "How many votes are there in prison reform?" And even in that respect, Jenkins disappointed many of his supporters. He'd been seen as a very liberalising Home Secretary when he was Home Secretary in the first Wilson government. But in the second guise, he becomes quite reactionary. And part of that is because the IRA is now killing people in Britain itself. And Jenkins takes a very strong line against the IRA. He passes the Prevention of Terrorism Act 1974 after the Birmingham pub bombings, a horrific set of bombings where many died and hundreds were killed. It's all passed within 18 hours, and it gives the Home Secretary profound powers over detention without charge, 5 days detention without charge. It prescribes the IRA, makes it illegal to be in the IRA. It allows for the police to enter properties without a warrant if the Home Secretary says so. So It's very sort of anti-civil liberties. So that disappoints some of his supporters. He perhaps redeems himself in some of their eyes by taking a very leading role in the 1975 European referendum. He's the chief advocate for staying in the common market on the Labour side. Of course, on the Conservative side, the former Prime Minister Edward Heath probably is the most prominent. And of course, that was a big victory for staying in the common market. And so you might say that really boosted his standing. But it didn't within the Labour Party. You've got to remember the Labour Party was majority Eurosceptic. A majority of Labour MPs voted leave. A majority of Labour members voted leave. The trade unions were overwhelmingly in favour of leaving, etc., etc. So Barbara Castle said to Roy Jenkins to shut up about Europe. A little word of advice. She said, "Of course the press is wanting to egg you on. You are their mouthpiece for Europe, and they are using you. But your friends ought to know better. They are driving you into a course that can only ruin your political career." And Jenkins goes red in the face when Barbara Castle says this to him and becomes quite emotional. And he replies back to her, "What makes you think that I care about my political career?" And so by that point, there's a sort of sense that Jenkins is almost pursuing a path of self-destruction in the way that he is maneuvering, and he's weakening himself as a leadership candidate. In the background of all of this, unbeknownst to pretty much everyone else, Harold Wilson has quietly approached Roy Jenkins and offered him the presidency of the European Commission, which is going to become available later that year. And I think, although Jenkins doesn't accept it at that point, I think that becomes a more and more attractive prospect for Jenkins as we enter into this leadership contest.
So we've done a Foreign Secretary and a Home Secretary. We've not yet come to the other great office of state, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Now, very often when there is a change of leader and Prime Minister mid-term, the Chancellor is in a very advantageous position. Of course, as you mentioned at the outset, in 2007, it was only the Chancellor, Gordon Brown, who could get nominated to replace Tony Blair. Something that's unlikely to be the case for Rachel Reeves, we should say, should Keir Starmer fall, but nevertheless. On the Conservative side as well, if you think about the people who have taken over, being Chancellor of the Exchequer is very often somewhere in their CV, whether it's people like Rishi Sunak and a generation earlier John Major, whether it's Harold Macmillan, whether it's sort of much touted leaders like Brad Butler. So being Chancellor usually puts you in a very good position. The Chancellor at this time is Denis Healey, also a figure of the Labour right. How does he line himself up to try and take on the top job?
Well, if Roy Jenkins was saying and doing things that upset the wider Labour Party, Denis Healey was making himself even more unpopular with the things that he was doing and saying as Chancellor. The timing is really bad for Healey. And it's interesting because Healey had been tipped off in December of 1975 that Wilson would be going in a few months. So he should have been on notice that a vacancy was soon going to arise. Perhaps he just didn't care. A few days before Wilson resigned, there was a debate in the House of Commons on the government's public expenditure white paper, which Healey was seeing through, and it was proposing £3 billion, 1976 money, of spending cuts. This was extremely unpopular with the left of the Labour Party. The government actually lost the division on this. There was a vote of no confidence put down in the government the following day. But Healey gave a tour de force speech in defence of the government and its economic programmes. However, some of the MPs on the left of the party didn't react very well to this. One of those MPs was an MP called Russ Kerr, the widower of Anne Kerr, who we've talked about in a previous episode. And he starts shouting at Healey, "Bastard! Bastard!" And Healey and Eric Heffer, who would become Michael Foot's sort of heavy in the leadership contest, calls Denis Healey a Stalinist. And Healey returns as good as he gets and says to them, Go and F yourself, you effers, but says the whole thing. When he was later asked about this exchange, Denis Healey said that Russell Kerr, quote, cast doubt on my paternity, so I praised his virility. He, around this time, had also condemned the Labour left as, quote, out of their tiny Chinese minds. This was reported widely in the press. This got out to the public. One journalist at the time rather delicately said that Healey was, quote, not always or customarily a sweet and lovable or even tactful person. The left-wing Labour MP Maureen Culhune called Denis Healey in the press a political thug. That being said, there were figures on the Labour left who liked Denis Healey and respected him because of his, I think, intelligence and also his pugnaciousness and bravery. And one of them was Barbara Castle. And it's rather interesting because, as I said, Barbara Castle was the first person to tell Michael Foot that he should stand for leader. Well, she also asked Denis Healey to stand for leader. And she thought what she was doing there was splitting the right-wing vote. Of course, she didn't put it in those terms for Healey, but she told him that he needed to stand, that he'd be a very good candidate. And Healey had been reluctant to stand, but he was effectively talked into it. He told Castle that he didn't think that he could win, that he thought that Foot and Callaghan would get about 100 votes each, Jenkins would get about 70, and then he and Tony Benn would be left fighting over the remainder, and it would be a rather embarrassing result. Barbara Castle said to him that while it was true that he ran risk of humiliation on the first ballot, if he could only survive to the second, his chances would improve enormously. And she said to him, we need you to be the Stop Jim Callaghan candidate. Well, Healey liked the idea and turned out to be terrible advice, but Barbara Castle credited herself in her diary as saying, who knows, I might have secured Mike's victory by my timely phone call.
And then the final candidate that we need to come on to discuss is a figure who we've spoken about on this podcast before, because he was one of the Labour lives cut short that we discussed last year, and that is Tony Crosland.
Yeah, so Tony Crosland, also figure on the right, seen as the great sort of intellectual revisionist of socialism, the author of The Future of Socialism. A couple of years before, he published a book called Socialism Now, which was quite well reviewed. However, Barbara Castle was very dismissive of his chances. She said, quote, despite the endless build-up he gets in the press, he isn't a serious contender at all. He had stood for deputy leader in 1972, so when Roy Jenkins resigned in 1972, he was actually deputy leader of the Labour Party at the time. It created a vacancy, and Crosland went for the deputy leadership, as did Michael Foot, but they both lost to Ted Short, who we've talked about before. He wasn't a very proactive campaigner. He sort of breezily said that the new MPs in the 1974 intake will vote for me. Well, he had no evidence for that. I think it was basically because he knew that any of the MPs before 1974 were unlikely to vote for him, and it was just a hope and a prayer that the new MPs would. Even those who were close to him, those who admired him, didn't want to vote for him. In one instance, Roy Hattersley, who really idolized him, was talking to him about the leadership contest, and Crosland says to Hattersley, I take it you'll vote for me. And Hattersley said, well, I'm not actually, I don't want to waste my vote. Crosland was really hurt by this. He said, you'll not vote for me, even on the first ballot? Then F off, he said. In the end, he had a rather eccentric collection of MPs who voted for him. One of his own supporters, George Cunningham, described them as a motley collection of screwballs and crackpots. Why did he do it? Why did he stand if he wasn't going to do very well? Well, his wife, Susan Crosland, in her biography said that it was probably vanity. Crosland believed that he was better than many of the people standing. Crosland had been Tony Benn's tutor at Oxford. He saw himself as the intellectual superior of at least Benn and Callaghan, and on par with Denis Healey and Roy Jenkins, probably saw himself as a bit even intellectually superior to them and Michael Foot. So he couldn't sort of bear to think that these inferiors would stand. And I think he couldn't bear to think that the likely person to win was someone he saw as intellectually bereft, which was Jim Callaghan. So in a fit of vanity, he puts his name forward, but he is not seen as a serious candidate.
So they're the runners and riders. Very often, one of the striking things in leadership contests isn't just who is standing, but who isn't. Not just the obvious people, the never had a chances, who don't put themselves forward. But if you take some recent examples, something like 2016, when Theresa May becomes leader of the Conservative Party, and two of the most prominent potential leaders from just a year earlier, George Osborne and Boris Johnson, both declined to stand, and she has this rather charmed ascent to the top. That was certainly a contest in which who didn't stand mattered as much, if not more, than who did. So who was declining to stand in 1976?
I mean, I think these were the six most obvious people to stand. If you were to then go further down the list, you look at who didn't stand, who might have stood. The one I always think of course, with this is Barbara Castle, who I think would have been an absolutely wonderful Labour leader and Prime Minister of this country, perhaps the greatest ever. But she didn't stand partly because her position in the party had been damaged with her role in the previous Labour government as employment secretary and overseeing the In Place of Strife white paper, which was the proposals for trade union reforms, which really angered the trade union wing of the party, but also was seen as going a bit too far by many members of the left of the party as well. But she was really hated by the trade union wing. And of course, as I said, Jim Callaghan was of the trade union wing. And what's the first thing Jim Callaghan does when he becomes Prime Minister? Well, he sacks Barbara Castle from the government. I think also in her diaries, she expresses a degree of self-doubt. She sort of never really talks herself up as a potential leader or Prime Minister. She sort of sees being a cabinet minister as the height of her abilities. I think that's probably she's been hard on herself, but it's interesting that she had that mindset. Of course, by this time, there's already a woman leading the Conservative Party, so it wouldn't have been it would have obviously been a big thing to have a woman prime minister. It wouldn't have been quite as shocking given that Margaret Thatcher was the leader of the opposition at the time. Who else might you put in there? Well, another woman in the cabinet, Shirley Williams. She is quite popular, particularly on the right of the Labour Party, but more generally, she's quite well liked. She's seen as a very nice figure, kind figure, someone that everyone in the party kind of gets on with. I think it's a bit too early for her. She's only Price's secretary. It's not really a prominent enough position. I will say, though, she does stand for the deputy leadership later that year when Edward Short resigns. Well, he's basically pushed out by Callaghan. Callaghan doesn't like Short either. And but she loses that. So that tells you something. Michael Foot wins the deputy leadership contest later that year. And perhaps the third person you might say could have stood would have been Peter Shaw. Shaw was seen as a very successful campaigner in the 1975 European referendum, of course, a very staunch Eurosceptic. So you might put him as a figure of the left. But Shaw and Castle would not have wanted to distract from the Michael Foot candidacy. So it wasn't really something they seriously considered. And already the right wing of the Labour Party had 4 candidates competing with each other. So it would have been very unwise, I think, for Shirley Williams to have entered as well.
MPs spoke for the first time on the 25th of March. How do they cast their ballots?
Michael Foot comes top with 90 votes. Jim Callaghan second with 84 votes. Roy Jenkins in third with 56 votes. That's lower than people were expecting for him. If you remember, Denis Healey thought that Foot and Callaghan would get about 100 each. Jenkins would get 70, in the end he got 56. Tony Benn comes in fourth with 37 votes, Denis Healey with 30 votes, and in last place, Tony Crosland with just 17 votes.
So if we think about these in quite crude terms, Michael Foot, figure of the left, in the lead. But if you add up the candidates who are broadly on the Labour right, they have a majority of the votes.
Yes, that's right. So I think what you have to think about for this is looking at that split on the right of the party. Callaghan is the figure of the trade union right. Then you have Jenkins, Healey, and Crosland, which are all sort of the figures of the kind of middle class right of the party. Had those three come together behind one candidate, let's say behind Roy Jenkins, could Roy Jenkins have come ahead of Jim Callaghan in the initial ballot? Why does that matter? Well, I think if you looked at it in that case, if you'd had Michael Foot first, Roy Jenkins second, then Jim Callaghan third, and then Tony Benn fourth, would that have given Jenkins some sense of momentum? Could he have made an argument to the right-wing trade union MPs who are backing Callaghan that it's actually Jenkins who's the candidate who will take on Foot rather than Callaghan? And that's one of the great what-ifs of that contest. Under the rules of the party, Crosland is removed for the next round because he comes last. But actually, almost immediately, Tony Benn announces that he's withdrawing from the campaign and he is endorsing Michael Foot. So he's had his opportunity to put forward his policies. It's not got him anywhere. It's been a distraction. And now he wants Foot to be the consolidated figure of the left. Once Benn is gone, there is some pressure on Jenkins and Healey to withdraw and to endorse Callaghan, a bit like Benn had done with Foot. Jenkins does drop out, and Barbara Castle's quite critical of that. She accused him of political daintiness. She compared him unfavorably to Denis Healey. She said in her diary, "I bet Denis stays in the ring, despite his derisory 30 votes. But then Denis is a pugilist, not a patrician." Tony Benn writes of Roy Jenkins, "He looked shattered." I think Roy does now realise that he can't ever be leader of the Labour Party. So Jenkins goes, he endorses Callaghan, but as Barbara Castle speculated, Denis Healey, being the pugilist, stays on to fight in the next round.
So the next ballot takes place a few days later. The field has been halved to just the three remaining people that you mentioned. Is it enough to change the dynamic at the top of the table?
The top of the table does change. The first ballot was on the Thursday. The second ballot takes place on Tuesday, the 30th of March. It happened to be Harold Wilson's final Prime Minister's questions. Not long after PMQs that afternoon, the second ballot is declared. This time, Jim Callaghan is first on 141 votes. Michael Foot is in second on 133 votes. And Denis Healey gets a derisory 38 votes. So in percentage terms, Callaghan gets 45% of the vote, Foot gets 43% of the vote, and Healey gets 12% of the vote. Healey is eliminated. And really then the question is, who will be the beneficiary of Healey's 38 votes? Is it enough to put Michael Foot over the top? Foot would need 22, 23, 24 of Healey's 38 votes. The reason it's slightly changing is because there are a couple of MPs who are not voting. One of them actually dies during this contest. And the answer really is it's not very likely because, of course, Healey is on the right of the party, Foot is on the left. So it almost is seen as a formality as to who's going to win the third ballot.
One of the things that you always want, really, with the leadership system is to try and get a clear winner. And in the third and final round, with just two people remaining, that's going to happen to somebody.
Right. So they have the weekend. They come back on the Monday. We're now on the 5th of April. The final ballot is Jim Callaghan, 176, Michael Foot, 137. Brian O'Malley, the MP for Rotherham, didn't vote. He was having emergency brain surgery and actually died the following day at the age of 46. It's interesting. Callaghan gets a majority of 39, and that morning, that was exactly the number that Harold Wilson had predicted Jim Callaghan would get. So Wilson really did know his parliamentary party. Cledwen Hughes, chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, informs the candidates before announcing the result to the full parliamentary party. when he goes to tell Jim Callaghan, Callaghan is overcome with emotion. He says to himself, "Prime Minister," and his eyes start to fill with tears. "And I never even went to university." And then Hughes says to Callaghan, "Well, you're in good company. The two greatest prime ministers of the century did not go to university." Well, he got that wrong because Clement Attlee went to Oxford. No, he had in mind Lloyd George and Churchill, not Ramsay MacDonald, although he didn't go to university either. The result is then announced to the Parliamentary Labour Party. Barbara Castle writes rather cattily in her diaries that she thought that when Michael Foot's name was read out, the cheers and applause were louder actually for Foot than they were for Callaghan. So she felt that even though Callaghan had won in numbers terms, that the enthusiasm of the party was stronger for Foot. And at that point, Harold Wilson's time as Prime Minister is coming to an end, a matter of hours, a matter of minutes. The transition will take place, and the Parliamentary Party gives Harold Wilson a standing ovation. And Jim Callaghan is now leader of the Labour Party and very soon to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
In one sense, this feels as if you wanted to try and pinpoint the last hurrah of a certain version or iteration of the Labour Party and Labour movement in this country, I wonder whether Jim Callaghan's election as leader is it. Because you mentioned his story, the poverty he came from, the fact he didn't go to university, that he was in the Navy. Afterwards, you wouldn't get a Labour leader like that. There's never been one since who is like that. And so I wonder, Richard, just to wrap this episode up, how do you look back on the significance of that, both in the context of 1976, but the wider history of the Labour Party?
Well, it showed at the time the strength of the trade union right in the Labour Party, the old Labour right. And these are people who are very different, I think, from the right of today's Labour Party. I think the right of today's Labour Party are the successors to Roy Jenkins. And the old Labour right were, in that respectly, I think, are really an endangered, critically endangered species in the Labour Party. This is a group of people for whom, although they're on the right of the party, they have a profound class consciousness. They have a profound sense of the power of the Labour movement, the importance of organised labour, and really what they want the Labour Party to do is to focus on improving the material conditions of the working class. They're not too concerned about what we might call post-material values or issues. They're not concerned particularly about things like the environment or world peace or, kind of these bigger global concerns. Jim Callaghan is sometimes described as one of our most conservative prime ministers, at least socially. Callaghan was apparently taken by surprise when he learned that there were homosexuals in the Labour Party. And when he was told this as prime minister, he asked his political advisors not to mention any of this to his wife Audrey because he thought it might upset her. It is, as you say, and as we've already remarked on, notable that he defeats these 5 Oxford graduates, all of them not just Oxford graduates, but in their own ways, either academics or prominent writers, intellectuals on the left. And apparently, when Callaghan entered Downing Street as Prime Minister, he said to an aide, "There are many cleverer people than me in the Labour Party, but they're out there and I'm in here."
We finish as ever by discussing some books. So I'll go first. This week I wanted to talk about a book I read a little while ago, actually, which is the diary of Alex Salmond during the Scottish independence referendum of 2014. And it's called The Dream Shall Never Die. There are 3 reasons that I wanted to mention it. The first is that I thought it was incredibly readable. So I think if you do read it, I think you'll enjoy it. The second is that I have this great, almost morbid fascination with the 2014 independence referendum, this dreadful moment of jeopardy for the very territorial integrity of the United Kingdom, which I feel like at the time, so many people nodded along with the idea that the question would be put to the referendum. But when you look at it with hindsight, it feels staggering. But the third reason is that I think Alex Salmond was a deeply flawed but really remarkable politician. And part of what made him remarkable, I think, is that he had such a deep and rich sense of Scotland and Scottishness. There has been a habit since 2014, and I think Nicola Sturgeon was the worst of this, to basically shrink Scottish nationalism down to a slightly whinging anti-Westminster, anti-Englishness, which is actually what I think Nicola Sturgeon largely represented. She was a very effective articulator of it, but there was never from Nicola Sturgeon, or in anything that I heard from her, this grand vision of Scotland as an independent country, or this entrenchment in Scotland's history as a remarkable nation in and of itself. Those things oozed out of Alex Salmond in almost everything that he did. And I think it makes him the most effective articulator for Scottish separatism that there has been in Scottish politics for at least a generation. So that is a book, I think, that gives a very readable little snapshot into that particular moment in time and that very particular man. The Dream Shall Never Die by Alex Salmond. Richard, what book do you want to talk about this week?
Well, you mentioned Scotland, and the other week you and I were up in Edinburgh and we went to one of your favourite bookshops called Topping and Company, which has a series of shops around the country. And while we were there, I just happened to see a book called God in Number 10, The Personal Faith of the Prime Ministers from Balfour to Blair by Mark Vickers. And I've really enjoyed this book so far. It is a snapshot of the prime ministers from Arthur Balfour, who becomes prime minister in 1902, to Tony Blair, who is prime minister until 2007. So over a century of British prime ministers, and each chapter is an exploration of their faith. And it's really interesting. I mean, in some cases, we have a good sense of what prime ministers believed. In other cases, it's less clear. But Vickers undertakes a very forensic analysis of trying to piece together through archives and memoirs and diaries and other people's comments on prime ministers, what actually was it that they believed? How strong was their faith in God? What type of Christianity did they practice? All of these prime ministers, of course, were Christians and indeed Protestants, although Tony Blair converted to Catholicism after he left Downing Street. Our first non-Christian prime minister was Rishi Sunak, who was a Hindu. Of course, Benjamin Disraeli was Jewish, but was a convert to Anglicanism as a boy. So it's a great book. And my only critique is I wish that it went up to the present day. I wish it hadn't stopped with Blair, because I think the personal faith of prime ministers like Gordon Brown and Theresa May would be really fascinating. I'd love to understand and learn more about Rishi Sunak's Hinduism and what that means for him. Keir Starmer, I think, is one of the most outwardly atheistical prime ministers that we've had, and might be interesting to explore how consistent that has been throughout his life. But that, I suppose, is for Volume 2. So if you're listening, Mark Vickers, get out there and write the second volume of God in Number 10.
We'll have links to the chosen books in our show notes, but that's all for this week's Since Attlee and Churchill. We'll be back on Thursday with our next instalment of Matters of Interest. We'll see you then.
Thanks very much.